Hey everybody, welcome to the video and welcome back to the channel. If you haven't been here since February, I know a lot of you probably don't play under any other DFS sports, and I have not covered any NFL DFS since the Super Bowl. So if you are coming back for the first time in a while, welcome back. If you're a frequent visitor of the channel, welcome anyway. It's nice to see you guys again, and I am super excited to be covering NFL DFS once again. It's been a long time coming, but we are finally here for week 1 of the NFL season over on Draftkings. If you're new to the channel, what I'd like to do early on in the week is take a first thoughts, first look video, throw some guys in the player pool at each position, and we'll just take a look at the matchups, the statistics, the Vegas totals, and I just have some guys that stood out to me early on. Then we'll get into the more in-depth analysis later on in the week where I do my closing, I don't know, what do you want to call it, final thoughts, picks, or some core plays or something like that. So we'll get more in depth later on in the week, but these are the guys that stood out to me early on, just looking at price tags, looking at matchups, and using all the information that we have available to us currently. But before we continue, as always, if you guys could just leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, you might as well hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be here all season long trying to help you guys become better NFL DFS players, and I cover other sports as well. So if you're going to keep coming back to the channel each and every single day, or each and every single week, you might as well hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out whenever I post new videos. And if you don't follow me on social media, I'm at Pennell16 over on Twitter, cpen16 over on IG, and if you want some more content over on Patreon, it's always much appreciated. You can get access to all the extra content that I put out, including my cheat sheets and my entire spreadsheets, as well as my Discord chat, and we got 300 plus people there. So if you want to come in, hang out, links to the description below. If not, hey, that's fine. Let's just dive into today's slate. So as usual, we'll start with the quarterback position, and up top we have Lamar Jackson at a massive 8,100 price tag. Now, to be honest, I'm usually a guy that likes to spend down at quarterback, especially in cash games, but I always make an exception for Lamar Jackson, because when you're rostering Lamar, this is no disrespect to him, but you're also getting like a running back. I mean, obviously he can throw the ball exceptionally well. He was the NFL MVP last year, threw a bunch of passing touchdowns, was great through the air, but when you roster him, it's like you're rostering two players. You get a running back and you get a quarterback. It's absolutely awesome. So I don't typically like to spend that much for quarterback, but I always make an exception for Lamar Jackson. I called him a video game in every single video last year, and that's pretty much what he is. It's like impossible to stop. The moves he makes on the field, it should not be possible, and he should not be able to run the ball as well as he does and throw the ball as well as he does. He is very fun to watch, and it pains me to say this as a Browns fan, but I'm trying not to be biased here. I think he's an exceptional football player. Now, if we're looking at his statistics last season, I mean, not a whole bunch of damage through the air in terms of yardage, only 208 yards per game, but nearly 2.5 passing touchdowns per game. But the rushing ability is what really gets me to play Lamar Jackson each and every single week. He was averaging 80 rushing yards per game, which is 8 DraftKings points per game on the ground, 9 rushing attempts, nearly half a rushing touchdown per game, 6.9 yards per carry, and 113 QBR rating. Now, the matchup versus Cleveland, I wouldn't say it's an absolute cakewalk, but I wouldn't say it's nothing to be too scared about either. Now, the offensive line versus defensive line matchup is horrendous for Lamar Jackson, but look, it's going to be hard to contain him. The Browns linebacker group is really nothing to be scared of here, and he should be able to have his way. I was looking at his game log last season and his 2 starts versus Cleveland last year. He scored 33.8 points against them in Week 16. Then all the way back in Week 4, he scored 26 fantasy points versus them. So I really don't see how Cleveland's going to stop Lamar Jackson. They have one of the highest team totals on the slate at 28.25. Now, the only issue is that they are 8-point favorites here, so maybe the Ravens get to the point where they don't have to keep their foot on the pedal and just absolutely just having to keep the offense going. But if Cleveland makes this a close game, I could see Lamar Jackson going absolutely off at home in Baltimore. So definitely have some interest in Lamar. And Cleveland, they're a team that can be a wild card. I think they're going to be either really good or they're just going to be their usual Cleveland self and probably go 6-10. The talent's there. Now, I know the Baltimore Ravens have a pretty good defense, but if the Browns can play up to their potential and keep this game close, Lamar Jackson should have an exceptional game here. So don't really like spending this much for a quarterback, but I always make an exception for Lamar Jackson because he's a video game. I mean, he can do whatever he wants on the field. He can run the ball. He passes the ball. It's always nice because you get pretty much 2 positions in one when you roster Lamar Jackson, so I think he's an excellent option. Dropping down to Russell Wilson here. He comes at 7,000. I have a lot of interest in this game. It's the highest over-under on the slate at 49. Well, actually, I take that back. Tampa Bay, New Orleans is actually at 49.5. But very close spread here, and I love both offenses. And I think Russell Wilson, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, excellent options. And you can easily run that back with guys on Atlanta like Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley. You can even use Matt Ryan, who I have listed below. So I think this entire game is stackable, and definitely like the passing game options here. But Russell Wilson, he seems a bit expensive to be honest, but I still think he's fine at 7,000. And really, this is just one of the best games to stack, and it's pretty easy to stack as well, if we're being honest. But if you're looking at the matchup for the Seahawks versus Atlanta, Atlanta was a team that struggled defensively last season. They were 25th DVOA versus the pass, allowed nearly 22 DraftKings points per game, 256 passing yards per game, nearly 2 passing touchdowns per game. Didn't really pose much as an interception threat. Now, they have a negative offensive line versus defensive line pass blocking matchup, but Russell Wilson, he's a guy that's mobile, so you always get at least a little bit of rushing upside. Nothing near Lamar Jackson. He only averaged 21 rushing yards per game, but still, I think Russell Wilson is certainly fine here, and you can easily stack him up with guys like Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf that really aren't that expensive. And I also don't mind running that back with a guy like Julio Jones, Hayden Hurst, or Calvin Ridley for the most part. So I think Russell Wilson's fine. I think this is an elite game to target. I mean, only a 1.5 point spread here, so this should be pretty back and forth. We're also going to be in the Dome at Atlanta, so definitely like the Seahawks versus Atlanta, or the Seahawks-Atlanta game. I guess I should say Seahawks-Falcons instead of Seahawks-Atlanta. But yeah, definitely a good game to target. And speaking of that game, we have Matt Ryan at 6,700. He was a guy that passed the ball a ton last season. He had over 40 pass attempts per game, 66.2% completion percentage, nearly 300 passing yards per game. And they were a team that played pretty fast as well. But again, I just like this game as a whole. 49 over-under, which is tied, or not tied, it's actually second right behind the New Orleans game, which is at 49.5. But we have a very close spread here, and we actually have Atlanta coming in as a slight dog. So they should be passing the ball quite a bit. And Seattle's defense was not that great versus the pass last season. They were 15th DVOA, which is kind of mid-pack, but allowed nearly 20 DraftKings points per game to quarterbacks, 275 passing yards per game, and just a little bit over a touchdown. But a nice pass blocking advantage here for Matt Ryan at a 30% advantage when it comes to the pass blocking. And I just like this game here. I think Atlanta's got plenty of options you can use with Matt Ryan, including Hayden Hurst, Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley. So 6,700 for Matt Ryan. It does feel a little bit expensive, especially for someone that can't really run the ball. But the volume should be there, and look, I think this is an excellent game to target. And he's got some pretty good options you can use to stack with Matt Ryan and then run it back on the Seattle side as well. Now, going down a little bit cheaper, this is where I usually typically like to be in cash games. If I'm not spending up for Lamar Jackson, I tend to spend down. And Carson Wentz at 6,300. I think he's a fine option here going up against Washington. And look, I apologize if I keep saying the Redskins, but it's going to be really hard not to get the name Redskins out of my head. It's going to be really hard to say the Washington football team. So I'll try to just say Washington. But look, their defense is nothing to be scared of here. And I'm actually pretty interested in the Eagles' offense as a whole here. They're all pretty cheap and definitely viable on this slate. Now, we'll say the Eagles are a little bit banged up heading into this game, but the price tags on them kind of make up for it. And the Washington, it's just a pretty soft matchup here for the Eagles. If you're looking at it specifically for quarterbacks in the pass game, they were 24th DVOA versus the pass last season, allowing over 21 DraftKings points per game, over 2 passing touchdowns, over 250 passing yards. I would certainly take that at only 6,300, and I got quite a bit of interest in the Eagles. I mean, I like DeSean Jackson a lot. I like Zach Ertz quite a bit, and also like Miles Sanders as well. So definitely pretty interested in the Eagles, and they're all fairly priced for the most part. Not the highest team total on the slate at all at 24.5, but I just like the way they're priced. Then Cam Newton, 6,100. This is pretty much just a matchup play for the most part. I know it might just be a little bit tough to trust Cam in his first game as a New England Patriot, and we'll have to see if he's got the offense just fully under his belt, but he gets that soft matchup versus Miami. I mean, they were just horrendous defensively last season, and versus the pass, they were just pretty darn awful. They were 32nd DVOA versus the pass last season, allowed about 23 DraftKings points per game, nearly 300 passing yards, nearly 2.5 touchdowns. You also have one of the best offensive line versus defensive line pass blocking matchups according to PFF this week. So yeah, Cam Newton at 6,100, I think he is certainly viable. If you're looking at his season statistics here last season, it wasn't a big enough sample size to really put any stock into it whatsoever, but we know the upside with Cam. I mean, he just doesn't have the best options in the world in New England, but the rushing upside is what's going to get me there, and he's nearly 6,000. He's very cheap, and I think he is certainly viable. He'll probably just gain some ownership just because he's facing Miami, and it's Cam Newton. He's done well before without, excellent options, but he's got Julian Edelman, and look, you got the rushing upside as well. He can always sneak in a touchdown near the goal line, or if he picks us up, 40, 50 rushing yards or something like that, he'll get the job done at only 6,100. And I love the soft matchup there for Cam. So if you want to go cheap in cash games or just in any format, Cam Newton at 6,100 does grade out pretty well at that price tag. Then we'll move on to the running backs. And Christian McCaffrey, he's going to be the easy RB1 on this slate. He has a massive price tag at 10,000, but kind of like with Lamar Jackson, you make exceptions for these guys because it's like you're rostering two positions. Like with Lamar, you're getting a running back and you're getting a quarterback. With Christian McCaffrey, you're getting a running back and you're getting a wide receiver. His numbers were just absolutely insane last season, and you could just pencil him in for a ton of points pretty much week in, week out. I mean, I could just read off his game log last season. I'm not going to, but he had games of 40, 50, 30s, pretty much almost not every single week with the 40s and 50s, but he was near around 30 points almost every single week. And the volume with him is insane. You're getting an uber talented player, and you're getting a guy with the most volume by far last season. Yes, I know some things have changed in Carolina, but I would still expect him to get that heavy workload in the pass game and the run game. And get the soft matchup here versus the Raiders. And I'm going to have to get used to not saying the Oakland Raiders. So I'm got to remember in my head that it's the Las Vegas Raiders, but definitely like McCaffrey here. If you're looking at the matchup versus the Raiders last season, they were 29th DVOA versus the run, allowed nearly 25 Draftkings points per game to running backs, 79 rushing yards. Didn't give up much in the receiving game to running backs, but look, it's Christian McCaffrey we're talking about. Like, look at the statistics on him last season: 86 rushing yards per game, nearly 18 rushing attempts, nearly a touchdown per game, 4.8 yards per carry. But this is what I really like, especially in a PPR format like Draftkings. He had 8.5 targets per game, 62 receiving yards. He had a 22% target share and a 35% weighted opportunity share. So Christian McCaffrey, despite the high price tag, is an elite play here. The matchup's good. He's got the best volume in the league. And it's really not that hard to fit him in because it's week one and we have plenty of value on this slate, especially at the wide receiver position, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And I typically like to spend down at wide receivers and then get my bell cow running backs in, especially for week one when there's can be some unknowns. Christian McCaffrey is the safest play on this slate. Yes, you have to pay an arm and a leg for him, but you know what you're getting with CMC. You can lock in your high volume and elite talent with CMC in a good matchup here. And this game has a 47.5 over-under, which is actually pretty high on this slate, so that's also something to keep in mind as well. And it's a close spread, but the spread really doesn't matter with CMC because he's involved in the passing game if they're trailing, or if they're up, they'll just hand him the rock a bunch of times. Then dropping down to Alvin Kamara, 7,200. I'm assuming he's playing here. Now, I know there's some contract issues with Alvin Kamara, but he's one of the most talented backs in the league, and personally, he's one of my most favorite running backs to watch. He's great in the passing game, and his balance and agility and elusiveness is just off the charts. He's pretty fun to watch. But anyway, I don't love the matchup versus Tampa Bay, but I kind of just like the game environment here. It's going to be a pretty close spread, and the Saints have one of the highest team totals on the slate at 26.5, and it's a 49.5 over-under, which is the highest in Vegas. And he's kind of like a CMC light, where he's not going to get the elite workload like CMC is, but he's got the talent. He's also heavily involved in the passing game as well. Not quite 8.5 targets per game, but nearly 7 targets per game. Only 12 rushing attempts per game, but he's a guy that's usually pretty efficient. Last season, he was a bit of a struggle, but don't forget he was injured for a decent portion, and I do think he was playing a little bit injured for a decent portion of the season, but we saw his high upside games, and when he's healthy, I mean, he's one of the top running backs in the league. He averaged 56 rushing yards per game last season on only 12 attempts, but still, I like the passing game work. He had a 30% weighted opportunity share, 19% target share, and like I said, nearly 7 targets per game with 40 receiving yards. Now, the matchup on the ground, I don't like it for Kamara. Tampa Bay was very stiff versus the run last season, third DVOA versus the run, only allowing 17 Draftkings points per race and 56 rushing yards per game. They were very, very good versus the run. But Alvin Kamara is a guy that's kind of matchup proof because he can get the job done through the air, and if they're struggling running the ball, they're just going to dump it off to him. Drew Brees will just dump it off to Kamara, and he should be able to get the job done that way. He's only 7,200 as well, so I think we're getting a good price tag on him, and anytime Kamara's in a high total game, I think he's going to be certainly interesting, especially if this game goes back and forth. So definitely like Alvin Kamara. Now we have Josh Jacobs here at 6,800. Now he's always a bit iffy on DraftKings because he wasn't really involved in the passing game last season, but we're kind of having high hopes on him and being more involved into the passing game. We've seen reports on him, maybe he can see 40 to 50 receptions this season. I mean, maybe we'll see, but still, I got high hopes for Josh Jacobs. I was a big fan of him last season. He's actually one of my favorite running backs. He graded out very well in PFF in a lot of major categories, and the guy's just a really good runner, and he gets a really good matchup here versus Carolina. And like I said, this game's got a pretty high over-under at 47.5, and the Raiders are also 2.5-point favorites here, which is a positive game script for Josh Jacobs. But if you're looking at his numbers last season, nearly 90 rushing yards per game, also was a bell cow, got nearly 19 carries per game, which is one of the tops in the league. Half a touchdown per game, 4.8 yards per carry. Now, what he really lacked in was the passing game. Only 2 targets per game, only a 7% target share, and only 12 receiving yards per game. I'm assuming these numbers are going to go up a bit this season, but I still love the matchup on the ground here versus Carolina. They were one of the worst teams versus the run last season. Always like to use running backs versus them. They were 28th DVOA versus the run, allowed nearly 32 Draftkings points per game, 125 rushing yards per game, 1.7 touchdowns, and 24 receiving yards as well, 2 running backs. Not a big offensive line versus defensive line run blocking positive matchup here for Josh Jacobs, but they were just so bad on the ground versus running backs last season, and this is a positive game script for Josh Jacobs, and he's a ultra-talented running back, so definitely like him here, especially if he's going to get an uptick in usage in the passing game for sure. Then Miles Sanders, 6,300. He's one of those Philadelphia Eagles that is dealing with an injury, but he's supposed to be good to go. But hamstring injuries can be a bit tricky, so that does give me some concern here. But all indications are he's going to be good to go. And if he gets a full workload here, he's going to be one of the better running back plays on the entire slate at only 6,300. And I really just like the matchup here for all the Eagles, and they're also fairly priced, so it's not that hard to stack up the Eagles now. It's not like they have a super high team total at 24.5. But positive game script for Sanders here. But he's kind of a guy that doesn't really matter about the game script because he's also going to be involved in the passing game as well. He had nearly 4 targets per game last season with over 30 receiving yards. The rushing game wasn't like crazy, but don't forget it was a very split backfield last season. But he should operate as the lead guy this season, and I have actually high hopes for Miles Sanders. So 6,300, I think we're going to get a pretty good price tag on him, and the matchup's pristine here versus Washington. Huge offensive line versus defensive line run blocking matchup here. 50% advantage, which I believe might be the highest on the entire slate. I'd have to double check that, but it's a huge advantage here for the Eagles. And they were 23rd DVOA versus the run last season, allowing over 30 DraftKings points per game and over 120 rushing yards per game here. So definitely like Miles Sanders at that price tag as long as he's good to go. If he happened to be on a snap count, obviously we'd have to temper our expectations. But assuming he's good to go, 6,300, definitely like that price for Miles Sanders. Then Antonio Gibson, 4,000. He became in play once Adrian Peterson got cut from the Redskins. Sorry to pause the video really quick, so I don't remember exactly where I left off. But anyway, I was talking about Adrian Peterson. He got released from the Redskins. So Gibson is going to be the assumed lead back now. And if he can get us close to 20 touches in this game at only 4,000, look, the matchup versus the Eagles is not very good. And he's a rookie, so there is question marks here. But the talent's there. And if he can get us near 20 touches at only 4K, if it's not efficient, I don't really care because at 4,000 we don't need much. And again, if we're going to get around 20 touches at that price tag, you're going to definitely become in play. And I would assume he's going to be pretty chalky on this slate if that's the case. Matchup versus the Eagles is not very good. It's a negative matchup here on the in the trenches for the offensive line versus defensive line run blocking matchup for the Redskins. The Eagles do have a pretty good defensive line, but 14th DVOA versus the run last season, allowed 21 DraftKings points per game, 70 rushing yards per game, and only 0.63 rushing touchdowns. So I wouldn't say the matchups here really good for Antonio Gibson. There's a couple of other running backs that could be in the mix, like J.D. McKissick and Peyton Barber. But I think, he should get the first crack at the carries here, and at only 4,000, I like that price tag, and he makes it a very easy fit into your flex spot, or even as your RB2, and that's why it's going to be pretty, not hard to fit in guys like CMC, Alvin Kamara on this slate, especially if we can use Gibson at only 4,000, so certainly on my radar. Now, look, the Redskins, they're not a team I'm really going to want to target too much, but only an 18.5 implied team total. The over-under is kind of low at 43, and they're 6-point dogs here. But again, this is really just a price play for a guy that could have, pretty high volume usage in this game. Then we'll move on to the wide receivers. And we'll start with the studs like Michael Thomas, Julio Jones, Davante Adams. Now, to be honest, more likely I'll probably end up being in the Metcalf and below tier because I plan to spend up on running back a bit because it's week 1, and if you can just lock in those bell cow running backs that are going to get touches, I usually tend to go with that over the wide receivers because they're going to be a little bit more iffy. But Michael Thomas, he's super expensive. If you have the money for him, great. I would rather pay up for CMC than Michael Thomas on this slate. But look, he was one of the most safe options in fantasy last season. I mean, he was just so consistent. Like, if you're looking at his game log last season, he only had one game below double-digit points. Like, he was just so consistently good, frequently gave you over 30-point games. I mean, he was phenomenal. It was kind of like playing a running back, to be honest, because you knew the volume was going to be there. And look, I mean, he's a fine play here, but again, I prefer getting up to CMC. But the numbers last season for him were elite, over 11 targets per game, over 100 receiving yards per game, which means you were going to get the 3-point Draftkings bonus on average every single game. 40% market share of the air yards, 75% weighted opportunity share, 32% target share, half a touchdown per game. Like, Michael Thomas is obviously a fine play here. And I got the other advanced statistics on here too, where they play the left side, the slot, the right side. That's all on there. But look, it's Michael Thomas. You don't really have to get into the matchup too much because he's kind of matchup proof for the most part. But he's got a nice advantage here according to PFF against Dean. And if you're looking at the matchup for fantasy points wise and the yards given up last season for Tampa Bay versus wide receivers, they were one of the worst teams in the league versus wide receivers specifically. Overall, they were 12th DVOA versus the pass, but they still struggle versus the wide receiver position specifically. Give up nearly 200 receiving yards per game to wide receivers, 1.31 touchdowns per game, and over 45 DraftKings points per game. So if you got the money for Michael Thomas, yeah, he's an excellent option. Here's the highest over under the slate. Saints have one of the highest team totals, close spread, so the game should be pretty back and forth. And it would not surprise me if Michael Thomas comes out, gets 12 catches, 130 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And if he does, yeah, he's going to be a phenomenal play. But if I had to pick between spending up for CMC or Michael Thomas, I'll side with CMC because you know you're going to probably get close to 30 touches out of him. Then dropping down to Julio Jones, 7,700. I wouldn't say he's as safe as a play as Michael Thomas, but that also comes with a $1,300 discount. And I just like this game in general. I mentioned it with Matt Ryan and Russell Wilson, but this is definitely a game to target. Only a 1.5 point spread, a 49-point over-under, and a 23.75 implied team total for the Falcons. Now, while Julio Jones was not as rock solid as Michael Thomas, still great numbers last season. Nearly 10 targets per game, 92 receiving yards. He's always been a guy that struggles a bit in the touchdown department, only 0.4 touchdowns per game last year, but a 25% target share, 1,900 air yards at 8 out of 12.2. Yeah, he's going to be a fantastic option here. Obviously, he's going to have an advantage here in PFF. Julio Jones really will never have a negative advantage in PFF because he's one of the best, obviously one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, arguably the best. Now, the matchup versus the Seahawks last season for wide receivers or just for the pass in general, they were 15th DVOA versus the pass, and they allowed nearly 35 DraftKings points per game to wide receivers, 155 yards per game, and only 0.75 touchdowns. But it's Julio Jones. I think this is an elite game environment. If you're using Matt Ryan, probably makes sense to stack him up with a guy like Julio Jones or Calvin Ridley. I do not have Calvin Ridley on the list, but he is certainly playable as well. But love that game in all formats. Then we have Davante Adams here at 7,300. Now, Minnesota was a team that did struggle versus the wide receiver position, and Davante Adams is just one of the rock-solid, safe wide receivers you can play each and every single week. And he's really cheap, too. You're getting a near $2,000 discount off of Michael Thomas, which just seems a bit too much. Don't really love this game for DFS purposes, but Davante Adams is just a safe play pretty much every single week. 29% target share, 67% weighted opportunity share, over 10 targets per game. If you're looking at the matchup for the Vikings last season, they were 7th DVOA versus the pass, but they did struggle versus wide receivers, specifically allowing nearly 40 DraftKings points per game and over a touchdown to wide receivers each and every single week, and 170 receiving yards as well. So Davante Adams at this price tag going to grade out pretty well, and you can get a near $2,000 discount off of Michael Thomas. He's not as flashy as a play as Michael Thomas is, but he's still a good play nonetheless. Tyler Lockett, he's a good stacking option with Russell Wilson, or you could just run that back if you're using like Matt Ryan, Julio Jones. Running back with Tyler Lockett, I have no issues with that. Now, personally, if I'm picking between the two of Lockett or Metcalf, I'm going to go with Metcalf just because I like the boom upside with Metcalf here, and he's also a little bit cheaper. But I like everybody here versus the Falcons. They really struggled in the secondary last season, and really just in all aspects last year. But love the game stack, and if you look at the matchup versus Atlanta, last season versus the pass, they were 25th DVOA versus the pass versus wide receivers. Allowed around 35 DraftKings points per game, 165 receiving yards, and a touchdown per game. I like Lockett and Metcalf quite a bit here. Lockett might be a bit safer, but Metcalf's got that huge upside. And speaking of Metcalf, again, I already talked about the matchup, but really like the spot here for Metcalf specifically. And he's going to get a good matchup here versus Isaiah Oliver, or really whoever else he gets matched up against in that Atlanta secondary. So definitely think DK Metcalf is an elite play on the slate and definitely a great pairing with Russell Wilson. Or if you're using a guy like Matt Ryan and Calvin Ridley or Julio Jones, running it back with a guy like Metcalf that can stretch the field and obviously blow up an entire slate, definitely like the idea of using Metcalf here. Then Terry McLaurin, 5,600. I mean, obviously had a phenomenal rookie season last year. It looks extremely good. I mean, if you just watch the film on the guy, I mean, the guy runs great routes, and he's just a phenomenal receiver. Unfortunately for him, he's stuck on a pretty bad team, and Dwayne Haskins at quarterback is never something I would really recommend, or not something I really love out of my wide receivers. But if you're stacking the Eagles, it probably makes sense to run it back with a guy like McLaurin. And the Philly secondary is certainly beatable. If we're looking at their the matchup last season for them, they allowed over 41 DraftKings points per game to wide receivers, 1.31 touchdowns per game, 175 receiving yards, and they were 16th DVA versus the pass. He's also getting a really good wide receiver versus cornerback matchup here, according to PFF. And really, I mean, I just don't see. I mean, someone's gonna do something on the Redskins. It's probably gonna be either Gibson or McLaurin, or even both, and they're both so pretty cheap, so it's not that hard to fit them in. I don't typically love targeting the Redskins, but if you're using a bunch of these Eagles, you're probably going to hope the game stays at least somewhat close, so you're going to want to run it back with a Redskins guy, and Terry McLaurin's one of the top options for that. It's also a positive game script for him because they're probably going to be trailing as 6-point dogs here, and I think McLaurin should be able to do some damage in this game, and also like that price tag quite a bit, so I think he's an excellent play on this slate. Marquise Brown, so I usually like playing a wide receiver with my quarterback. Lamar Jackson is a guy that you really don't have to worry about that because he can get the job done on his legs. Like if there's games where he doesn't get a passing touchdown, he can still get you over 30 DraftKings points on the ground for the most part. So not really too concerned about pairing up a wide receiver with Lamar Jackson, but if I was going to, I would pick Marquise Brown here at 5,100. And he's not a guy we can expect a lot of volume from, but we're just kind of hoping he's efficient and he can hit a big play. And I'm kind of hoping Cleveland keeps this close. If you're playing Lamar Jackson or Marquise Brown, it might make sense to play a guy like Odell running it back and just hope that the Browns can keep this like a back and forth game. And if that's the case, we're going to see a lot of points scored in this game because we're going to have two capable offense. Obviously, you have the NFL MVP and Lamar Jackson, and you got a pretty talented offense on the Browns as well. So Marquise Brown, we're not expecting a lot of volume here, but he's certainly a guy that can hit the home run play. And the Ravens do have the highest team total on the slate at 28.25. And like I said, only 4.64 targets per game last season and only 41.71 receiving yards. So again, don't expect a lot of volume here, but I still think he's a fine option at only 5,100 to pair with Lamar Jackson if you want to run him back with a Cleveland Browns player. But you do not have to stack a wide receiver with Lamar. You can certainly play him naked and feel fine about it. Then DeSean Jackson at 4,900. This might be one of my more favorite wide receiver plays on the entire slate. I'd assume he's going to carry quite a bit of ownership as well. Look, it's simply just because the Eagles are. Sorry if I kind of cut off the video a little bit. I don't remember exactly where I let off, but anyway, the Eagles are pretty banged up here. I mean, Alshon Jeffrey just got activated off the PUP list. He's not expected to play in this game. We also have Jalen Reagor not going to be playing as well. So DeSean Jackson is the wide receiver one here. And I like the Eagles. I like Carson Wentz, and Washington's secondary is certainly beatable. So I got to like someone in the passing game here. Obviously like Ertz, but love DeSean Jackson here at only 4,900. If you guys don't remember last season, not that it really means too much here, but it's last season, week 1 versus Washington. He scored 20, I'm looking at Alshon Jeffrey's game log. Apologize about that, I was reading something else. But DeSean Jackson, week 1 last season versus Washington, he scored 38.4 DraftKings points. He had 8 receptions, 154 yards, and 2 touchdowns on 9 targets. Is that going to happen again? Probably not, but we know the guy's got burners. He can beat a defense deep. And look, if you want to use Carson Wentz and DeSean Jackson as a nice stack and run it back with Terry McLaurin, I mean, that's very low price tag, and you should be able to fit a lot of guys that you want in your lineups, like guys like maybe Michael Thomas, Julio Jones, even Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara. So I really like that cheap stack, and I'm loving DeSean Jackson on this slate. If he can get as close to double-digit targets at 4,900 versus a really weak Washington secondary, I am all about that. I would assume he's going to be very chalky in this slate, but he does grade out as one of the best plays for his price. Now, he only played a couple of games last season, so you really can't put too much stock into any of the season statistics, but had a phenomenal first game. He's obviously going to be a guy that's targeted deep. And if we're looking at the matchup here versus Washington, they were 24th DVOA versus the pass last season, allowing 36 DraftKings points per game to wide receivers and 1.31 touchdowns per game as well. He's got one of the biggest advantages on PFF as well, with a 51% wide receiver versus cornerback matchup advantage over on PFF. So love DeSean Jackson here. He grades out as a phenomenal play. Then we'll move on to the tight end position, and up top we have actually George Kittle. Sorry, that's not in order. But you have George Kittle 7,200. Now, personally, I'm not going to want to spend all the way up for tight end. I'd rather spend up at running back or wide receiver because we got some really good options like Zach Ertz, which is not $2,000 cheaper, but over $1,000 cheaper. And you got Hayden Hurst and Jack Doyle as well. And there's some other options as too. I could have listed quite a few other guys, but these were the 4 guys that kind of stood out the most. But George Kittle, he gets that elite matchup versus the Cardinals. Last season, tight ends just absolutely murdered the Cardinals each and every single slate. Now, I don't think they're going to be as bad versus the tight end position this season, but still, if we're just going off of last year, they just got crushed each and every single week. Did not matter who the tight end was. I feel like even CJ Uzomah did something versus them, if I remember correctly. But definitely George Kittle here if you got the money for him. I don't think he's necessary by any means because he's 7,200. I'd rather spend up at other positions. But the numbers last season were great, obviously. 28% target share, 60% weighted opportunity share, 26% share of the market of the air yards, 75 receiving yards per game, nearly 8 targets per game as well. Obviously, he's a freakish athlete. I mean, you can make a case for him being the best tight end in the NFL, him or Travis Kelce. I mean, athleticism-wise, I think George Kittle might have him beat there, but huge advantage here over on PFF, and I guess that's not the wide receiver versus cornerback matchup. It's more the tight end safety or linebacker matchup here, but George Kittle pretty much checks every single box, and if you're looking at the Cardinals last season versus the pass, they were 27th DVA versus the pass. Then versus tight ends, they allowed a touchdown per game, 71 yards per game, and nearly 20 DraftKings points per game. So certainly beatable versus the for the tight end position last season. And George Kittle, he's a fine play. I just don't think he's absolutely necessary at that price tag. Zach Ertz, though, I like Zach Ertz a lot at 5,800. You're getting a nice discount off of George Kittle. He's one of the better tight ends in the entire NFL. And he also makes a very nice pairing with Carson Wentz and DeSean Jackson. And you could also run that back with a guy like Terry McLaurin. I think that's a very nice value stack on this slate. And it's just a really soft matchup here versus the Redskins. And if you're looking at Zach Ertz's numbers last year, 8.5 targets per game, 0.4 touchdowns per game, 1,100 air yards, 8.6 ADOT, 61 receiving yards per game. If you're looking at the matchup for the Redskins, they allowed 14.4 DraftKings points per game to tight ends, 54 receiving yards, and they're 24th DVA versus the pass. So not quite as bad versus the tight end as the Cardinals were, but that's still fine for Zach Ertz, one of the best tight ends in the NFL, and I also like the Eagles' offense quite a bit, so definitely makes sense. I'd like a cheaper Zach Ertz. Hayden Hurst, 4,300, a new addition to the Atlanta Falcons here, but this is mainly just wanting to get exposure to the Falcons versus Seahawks game. And the Seahawks are one of the worst teams in the NFL versus tight ends last season. If you're looking at their splits, they allowed 15.7 DraftKings points per game to the position, and nearly 70 receiving yards as well. I loved using tight ends versus Seattle. They weren't quite as bad as the Cardinals were versus tight ends, but they were still pretty bad. And you could pretty much stream tight ends versus the Seahawks most weeks for the most part. Now, Hurst, he was on a different team last season, so I think looking at the statistics is kind of a waste of a time, but we know the Falcons got rid of Austin Hooper, so there's definitely a role to be had for Hayden Hurst here, and he's a talented guy as well. And at 4,300, I like the game stack here. I like getting pieces in this game, and I think he's a fine option at that price tag. It's going to be a close spread here, and it should be pretty back and forth, so I might get a cheap touchdown here out of Hayden Hurst. Then Jack Doyle at 3,600. He's just a really cheap option here, going up against a pretty poor Jacksonville defense. And the Colts actually have one of the higher team totals on the slate at 26.25. They're also heavy favorites here, so maybe they'll take their foot off the gas at some point. But Jacksonville, they're a team that's kind of going to be pretty bad. So not so far this season. They're going to be pretty bad this season, in my opinion. I mean, they're kind of just trading a lot of their key pieces. And I mean, when their defense was really good, most of those guys are gone at this point. And look, Jacksonville, I mean, they were kind of tough versus the tight end position last season, but I really don't expect them to put up too much of a fight here. And Jack Doyle at 3,600, he's a fine option. And we also know that Phillip Rivers loves the tight end position. We saw that with Hunter Henry and Antonio Gates over the years. So Jack Doyle at only 3,600, I think he's a fine option here. We can go with the statistics, but we got a new quarterback this season, but he's fine. 3,600, I've always liked playing Jack Doyle at this cheap price points because he's a pretty decent tight end. So I think that's it for the tight ends. We can move on to the defenses. I don't really like to spend too much time talking about defenses, and I should probably make this look a little bit cleaner. But up top here, we have the Bills at 3,700 going up against the New York Jets. And I just like targeting defenses and low totals. And that's pretty much what I did in every single time here. Like I got the Bills versus the Jets, the Patriots versus Miami, then we have the Colts versus Jacksonville. All decently low totals here, or low implied team totals for the opposing offense. The Jets team total of 16.5, which I think is the lowest on the slate. So I think the Bills are going to be fine. You have to pay up a little bit for them, but they're going to be a fine option here. One of the best defenses in the league. Patriots, were like a DFS dream last year. They just kept scoring touchdowns almost every single time. I kept telling myself, why do I want to pay this much for the Patriots defense? They're not going to keep scoring touchdowns. Well, they did. Now, again, that's a very random stat. You can't expect defenses to score touchdowns. But they seem like, I feel like they should be priced near right where the Bills are. So at 3,200, they're probably going to end up being pretty popular on the slate. They're almost the Dolphins. Yeah, they have some decent pieces, but for the most part, it wasn't an offense to be really too scared of. Only an 18.25 implied team total for the Dolphins on this slate. And look, I think the Patriots will be fine at 3,200. Probably going to be pretty high owned as well. Then the Colts versus Jacksonville, which they just got rid of Fournette. And overall, they're just not that great of an offense. Yeah, you got DJ Tark, which could be okay, but I mean, the Colts defense at 3,000 should be fine here versus the Jacksonville team with an implied team total of only 18.75. They're also heavy favorites here as well at 7.5 point favorites. So I think the Colts defense is fine. Or if you just want a punty defense, whatever. I don't really care because defense really isn't too much of a factor for me most weeks. Yes, I'd like to get a defense and a low total, but if I had to punt defense, sometimes I will do it. You just kind of got to hope that the chalk defense doesn't score a touchdown, so you're not screwed in cash games for the most part. But yeah, that's pretty much going to be it for the video, guys. I hope it was helpful. It was my first time doing an NFL video in quite some time, so hopefully I didn't sound too lost. I'm going to have to get myself back with the terms. I'm so used to talking MLB. I telling myself in my head, I was doing some practice runs on this, and I was like, don't call Atlanta the Braves, don't call Cleveland the Indians. I was trying my best there, and I was trying not to use any NASCAR terms, but I think we did okay. So hopefully this video was helpful, guys. If it was, remember to leave a like. If you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out. I really do appreciate that. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. If you want to follow me on social media, feel free to do that. If you want to support me on Patreon, feel free to do that as well. I have my spreadsheet out later in the week, the cheat sheet, the notes, and all that fun stuff. And you can hop into the Discord chat too. But yeah, good to be back. Glad to be doing NFL DFS content again. And for people that haven't been here since February, welcome back. It's nice to see you again. That'll be it. And see you guys in the next video for NFL.